They tell you war is about freedom. They tell you it's about democracy. They are lying. For the last 2 centuries, war has been the single most consistent business model in American history. It is more reliable than banking, more lucrative than oil, and more protected than any monopoly on earth. While millions of soldiers died in the mud and trillions of your tax dollars vanished into smoke, a small, elite group of families didn't just survive, they became the kings of the modern world. They didn't win by luck. They won because they owned the game before the first shot was fired. Look at the ledger of American history, not the propaganda. You will see a chilling, mathematical pattern repeating for 150 years. 5 families, 5 corporate empires, 5 major wars. Every time chaos erupts, their wealth multiplies. This isn't a conspiracy theory found in the dark corners of the internet. These are public records, government contracts signed in ink and paid for in blood. DuPont, the family that has monopolized explosives for 220 years. Rockefeller, the oil barons who fueled every side of every conflict. Morgan, the banking dynasty that lent governments the money to destroy each other. Lockheed Martin, the masters of the sky who turned the Pentagon into a personal ATM. Halliburton, the logistics giant that turned the fog of war into a limitless revenue stream. Their playbook is identical, every single time. War is declared, stock prices scream upward, no-bid contracts are quietly signed, budgets are overrun, profits are privatized, and when the peace treaty is signed, they keep the cash and wait for the next spark. But the terrifying part isn't that they profited, it's that they used that blood money to buy influence, rewrite laws, and create the very conditions that make war inevitable. If you want to understand who actually pulls the strings, and if you are tired of being fed the sanitized version of history, you need to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications right now. The history books won't teach you what I'm about to reveal, and the establishment certainly doesn't want you to connect these dots. Drop a like if you are ready for the raw truth. Let's tear open the first chapter of the American military-industrial complex with the family that literally invented it, the DuPonts. When you hear that name, you might think of Teflon pans or chemicals. You should be thinking of gunpowder. They have supplied the explosives for every single American conflict since 1802. The dynasty began with Eleuthère Irénée DuPont, a French chemist who landed in America in 1800. He didn't just see a new nation, he saw a market starving for firepower. A young America pushing west needed to blast through mountains for roads, clear mines, and fight wars. In 1802, the first DuPont gunpowder mill rose on the Brandywine River in Delaware. The location was a masterstroke. Close enough to Washington to whisper in the ears of politicians, but far enough away that if the mills blew up, it wouldn't level the capital. By the War of 1812, DuPont had already positioned itself as the primary supplier to the U.S. government. This was the birth of the Pattern. War breaks out. The government panics and needs supplies yesterday. DuPont is waiting. They have the capacity, they have the product, and they get the contract without competition. But it was the Civil War, 1861 to 1865, that turned DuPont from a business into an untouchable power. The scale of violence was unprecedented. 4 years of hell, hundreds of battles, millions of rounds fired. DuPont mills ran 24 hours a day, churning out over 4 million pounds of gunpowder. The contracts were worth tens of millions back then, hundreds of millions in today's value. Here is the detail that exposes the true nature of war profiteering. The DuPont family were technically Northern Democrats who opposed abolition. Some even sympathized politically with the Confederacy. But who did they sell their powder to? The Union. Why? Because the North had the gold. Ideology is for the soldiers. Profit is for the suppliers. When the Union won, DuPont was hailed as a patriotic savior of the Republic, all while their vaults were overflowing with cash generated from the slaughter of Americans on both sides. Fast forward to World War I, 1914 to 1918, and the pattern accelerates. Before America even entered the fight in 1917, DuPont was already shipping mountains of explosives to Britain and France. When the U.S. finally joined, DuPont's production capacity exploded. They supplied 40% of all explosives used by the Allies. Look at the math. DuPont's net earnings jumped from $5 million in 1914 to $82 million in 1918. That is a 600% increase in profit in 4 years. Is there any other legal industry on the planet that offers those returns? And what did they do with that war chest? Did they give it back? No. They used it to conquer the peace. They bought into chemicals, plastics, and synthetic materials like nylon. They used war profits to build a peacetime monopoly that entered every American home. Then came World War II, and the cycle repeated. Explosives, parachutes, and even a key role in the Manhattan Project to build the atomic bomb. They operated under cost-plus contracts. This is the holy grail of government corruption. It means the government pays all your expenses, plus a guaranteed percentage of profit. You literally cannot lose money. All the risk is dumped on the taxpayer. From Korea to Vietnam, from the Gulf War to the deserts of Iraq and Afghanistan, if it exploded, DuPont or its corporate successors got paid. Today, the DuPont family trust is estimated to be worth over $30 billion. 6 generations later, they are still living like royalty on the interest of gunpowder sold 2 centuries ago. But explosives are just the spark. To run a modern war machine, you need something even more critical. You need blood for the engine. You need oil. And one family wrote the book on how to hold the world hostage for fuel, the Rockefellers. If DuPont provided the spark, the Rockefellers provided the fuel. You cannot run a modern war machine on good intentions. You run it on oil. And for over a century, one family held the nozzle to the world's gas tank. John D. Rockefeller didn't just build Standard Oil, he built a global chokehold. By 1880, he controlled 90% of America's oil refining capacity. This wasn't capitalism. This was an empire that made the U.S. government look like a junior partner. When the Spanish-American War kicked off in 1898, the U.S. Navy was transitioning from coal to oil. That decision made the Rockefellers the most essential military asset in the Western Hemisphere. It taught the dynasty a lesson they would never forget. If you control the energy, you control the military. If you control the military, you control the outcome. Then came World War I, the first true industrial slaughter. Tanks, airplanes, trucks, battleships, they all drank oil by the millions of barrels. Standard Oil, despite being technically broken up by antitrust laws in 1911, still operated as a coordinated hydra through its successors like Exxon, Mobil, and Chevron. They supplied the fuel that powered the Allied victory. But here is the dark chapter that standard history books conveniently skip. The Rockefellers didn't just sell to the good guys. Standard Oil's foreign subsidiaries were fueling German submarines and tanks at the exact same time. They traded with the enemy through neutral countries like Switzerland. To them, it wasn't treason, it was just a diversified portfolio. They were fueling the very weapons that were killing American boys, and they were cashing checks from both sides of the trench line. By the time the armistice was signed, John D. Rockefeller wasn't just rich, he was the world's first billionaire. You would think they would stop there. You would be wrong. World War II exposed the true depth of this betrayal. While Americans were rationing gas and buying war bonds, Standard Oil of New Jersey, the grandfather of Exxon, was caught in bed with the Nazis. An investigation led by none other than Harry Truman discovered that Standard Oil had entered into a secret agreement with I.G. Farben, the German chemical giant. They shared patents for synthetic rubber, critical technology that allowed the Nazi war machine to keep rolling months longer than it should have. Truman's committee concluded that Standard Oil's greed had actively damaged the American war effort. Did anyone go to jail? Was the company seized? Of course not. They were too big to fail before the term even existed. The military needed their fuel too badly to prosecute them. The investigation was quietly buried, the contracts were renewed, and the Rockefellers walked away with a fortune that is estimated at $11 billion today. They eventually divested from oil to scrub their public image, but make no mistake, that dynasty was built on the black gold sold to armies that burned it to burn the world. But weapons and oil are useless, without the one thing that actually makes the world spin: money. Enter the House of Morgan. If the Rockefellers fueled the war, the Morgan banking dynasty bought the mortgage on it. Well, P. Morgan understood a terrifying truth about human nature. Governments at war are desperate addicts. They will borrow money at any interest rate because the alternative is annihilation. In World War I, before a single American soldier set foot in Europe, American banks led by J.P. Morgan had already picked a winner. They lent over $2 billion to Britain and France. In today's money, that is over $50 billion. This wasn't charity. It was a high-stakes gamble. They lent the Allies money to buy weapons, largely from American companies like DuPont. The money left the bank, went to Europe, and came right back to American corporations, while Morgan collected fees on every transaction. But by 1917, a nightmare scenario emerged. The Allies were losing. If Britain and France collapsed, they would default on those billions. The American banking system would implode overnight. The economy would vanish. Suddenly, American neutrality wasn't just a diplomatic stance. It was a financial suicide note for the Morgan Empire. So when President Wilson asked Congress to declare war in April 1917, it wasn't to make the world safe for democracy. It was to make the world safe for J.P. Morgan's loan portfolio. Senator George Norris saw right through the patriotic speeches. He stood up and told Congress, "We are going into war upon the command of gold. We are about to put the dollar sign on the American flag." He was right. We sent young men to die in the mud of France to secure the investments of Wall Street bankers. The pattern didn't stop when the shooting stopped. After the war, Germany owed reparations it couldn't pay. The Allies owed money to America they couldn't pay. Who stepped in? Morgan bankers. They structured the Dawes Plan and the Young Plan, lending money to Germany so Germany could pay the Allies, so the Allies could pay Morgan. It was a circle of debt, and Morgan took a cut at every single stop. World War II, Korea, Vietnam. The House of Morgan, later J.P. Morgan Chase, was always there, underwriting the debt, financing the defense contractors, profiting from the deficit spending that you and your children are still paying off today. The Morgan family fortune, estimated at $30 billion, sits on a foundation of war bonds and blood interest. But while bankers and oil barons worked the shadows, a new player was about to emerge, one that would dominate the skies and turn the Pentagon into a permanent cash cow: Lockheed Martin. While the bankers were collecting interest, a new beast was born to dominate the skies and drain the national treasury: Lockheed Martin, or more accurately, the hydra of companies that merged to become the single largest defense contractor on the planet. The Lockheed brothers started in 1912, but World War II was their golden ticket. They built the P-38 Lightning and the Hudson bomber, securing contracts worth hundreds of millions. But building planes wasn't their real innovation. Their genius was building a political chokehold on Washington, D.C. Lockheed realized early on that the best way to secure a contract wasn't to build the best plane, it was to buy the best politicians. They perfected the political insurance policy. They strategically scattered their factories and supply chains across as many congressional districts as possible. Why? Because if a congressman votes against a Lockheed jet, he is voting against jobs in his own district. He is committing political suicide. They made themselves unkillable. Look at the C-5 Galaxy transport plane in the 1,960 seconds. The initial bid was $2.1 billion. By the time it was delivered, the cost had ballooned to $5.3 billion. That is a 150% cost overrun. In the private sector, you go bankrupt. In the defense sector, you get a bonus. Because of the cost-plus contract, the more inefficient Lockheed was, the more money they made. The Pentagon couldn't cancel it because they had already sunk billions into it. It's the sunk cost fallacy weaponized against the American taxpayer. This wasn't a mistake. It was the business model. And it culminates today in the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter program. This is the single most expensive weapon system in human history. The original budget was $233 billion. The current estimate? Over $1.7 trillion. That is trillion with a T. It is 7 times over budget, years behind schedule, and plagued with over 800 documented defects. But can Congress cancel it? No. Because the F-35 has suppliers in 45 states. 90 senators have constituents whose livelihoods depend on this bloated, broken program. Lockheed Martin didn't just build a jet. They built a parasite that the host cannot remove without hurting itself. But if Lockheed owns the sky, Halliburton owns the ground. This is the company that turned the chaos of war into a line item on a balance sheet. Founded in 1919 as an oil services company, they realized by World War II that the military needs infrastructure fast, and they don't have time to shop around. Enter the no-bid contract. This is the holy grail of corruption. The government claims national security and urgency to bypass competitive bidding and hands the contract directly to Halliburton. During the Vietnam War, Halliburton's subsidiary, Brown and Root, paved roads and built bases across South Vietnam. Was it a coincidence that the founder, George Brown, was a massive financial backer of President Lyndon B. Johnson? Absolutely not. Johnson's political career was funded by Brown. Brown's company was funded by Johnson's war. It was a perfect circle of patronage. But the masterpiece of this corruption happened during the Iraq War. In the 1,990 seconds, the Secretary of Defense was Dick Cheney. He awarded Halliburton contracts in the Gulf War. Then, he left the government and became the CEO of Halliburton from 1995 to 2000. Then, he became Vice President of the United States. And suddenly, Iraq and Afghanistan happened. Halliburton, through its subsidiary KBR, was handed over $40 billion in contracts. No bidding. Cost plus pricing. The waste was nauseating. Pentagon auditors found billions in overcharges. They billed the U.S. government for meals they never served to soldiers. They billed for fuel trucks that never arrived. They billed for construction that was never finished. When they were caught, they shrugged and said war zones are chaotic. And what happened to Dick Cheney? While he recused himself from specific contract decisions, his former company's government revenue increased by 400% during his vice presidency. Their stock price tripled. When he left office, he still held millions in Halliburton stock options. This is the revolving door in plain sight. Politicians hire contractors, contractors hire politicians. They get rich, the company gets rich, and you get the bill. These 5 families, DuPont, Rockefeller, Morgan, Lockheed, Halliburton, didn't just stumble into wealth. They executed a specific 7-step algorithm that has been running in the background of American history for 150 years. And once you see the steps, you will realize why the wars never stop. Now, zoom out. Stop looking at individual scandals and look at the machine itself. These 5 dynasties didn't just get lucky. They perfected a specific 7-step algorithm that has been running in the background of the American economy for 150 years. This is the blueprint for how public wealth is transferred into private hands, justified by patriotism. Step 1. Pre-war positioning. Before the first shot is fired, they make themselves indispensable. DuPont built factories in peacetime, Rockefeller monopolized the refineries, Lockheed secured the patents. When the crisis hits, they are the only game in town. Step 2. The national security panic. When war starts, logic ends. They secure no-bid contracts because the government screams that there is no time for competition. They bypass the free market entirely. Step 3. The infinite money glitch. They utilize cost-plus pricing. This is the economic engine of the complex. The more they waste, the more they get paid. Efficiency is actually punished. Bloat is rewarded. Step 4. The sunk cost trap. They intentionally underbid to get the contract, then explode the budget once the government is committed. The F-35 isn't a failure. It's the most successful application of Step 4 in history. Step 5. The revolving door. They hire the very people who sign the checks. Generals retire on Friday and start Monday as executives at the defense firms they just regulated. It's bribery legalized as consulting. Step 6. Manufacturing consent. This is the darkest step. They fund the think tanks that write the papers arguing for war. They donate to the politicians who vote for war. They don't just supply the weapons, they help engineer the demand for them. Step 7. The Great Wash. They don't keep the money in weapons. DuPont moved into chemicals, Rockefeller into banking, Morgan into peacetime industry. They launder blood money into generational wealth that looks respectable on Wall Street. So, what was the price tag? Documented public contracts show these 5 entities extracted over $485 billion from American taxpayers. But if you include indirect profits and the empires built on that capital, the number is in the trillions. Let that number sink in. $485 billion. That isn't just money. That is lost human potential. That money could have funded free college for every American student for 20 years. It could have built a high-speed rail network connecting every major city. It could have rebuilt every crumbling bridge in the Rust Belt. It could have funded a century of cancer research. Instead, it bought $600 hammers, fuel for tanks that never moved, and private islands for CEOs. The opportunity cost of the American war machine is the American dream itself. And the most infuriating part? They are untouchable. DuPont was investigated for monopolies. Nothing happened. Standard Oil traded with Nazis. They got a slap on the wrist. Halliburton defrauded the military. They kept the contracts. In this system, fines aren't punishments. They are just a cost of doing business. A small tax on the billions they stole. This pattern is not history. It is happening right now, today, with your money. The names might change, companies might merge, but the algorithm remains perfect. War is profitable for the dynasties, profitable for the politicians, and fatal for the soldiers. If this video opened your eyes to the machinery behind the curtain, if you now see that war is a profit and loss statement for the elite, then you are ready for what comes next. We are going to decode every lie they've told you. Click that subscribe button and turn on all notifications. We are building a community of critical thinkers who refuse to be pawns in their game. Share this video with someone who needs to wake up. The history books are written by the victors, but the truth is written in the ledgers. I'll see you in the next investigation.